In the last video, we spoke about why this async await syntax is throwing off our action creator. Now, whenever I tell someone that, oh yeah, async await right here, it's throwing us off and it's making our request not work as expected, I always get a very common question as a follow-up immediately afterwards. People very frequently say, okay, well, what if we just remove async await like so? And so now we don't get any special syntax when this gets transpiled to ES5. Now we are, in fact, going to be returning a plain JavaScript object. We would not really refer to this variable as a response anymore. It is technically a promise. So I'm going to assign promise like so. Now the reason that we refer to this as a promise is that when we call this line of code right here, we are making a request over to our API. That is going to take some amount of time to complete that request. Like it might take 100 milliseconds or 500 milliseconds or 10 seconds. Who knows how long it's going to take. So we make this request right here. And then what gets returned to us and assigned to this variable is something that we call a promise. And that promise object essentially is going to give us a little finger or a handle, a little notification when the request is completed at some point in the future. So without the async await syntax, we do not get some data back right here. Instead, we get a promise object that is going to give us access to our data when we eventually get it at some point in the future. Now, with that in mind, the code you see here still works just fine. We can save this, flip back over to the browser, and you'll see that the error message has gone away. It's because we no longer have the nasty async await syntax, we are returning a normal JavaScript object. So, even though the error message went away, this code that you see right here is still probably not going to work as you expect. So in this video, I want to tell you why this would not work as you might expect. Okay, so as you might guess, the code snippet that we see is essentially tied to this item right here, the second reason that fetch post is not going to work. By the time our action object gets to a reducer, we will not have retrieved our data from that API. That is the root or the crux of the issue. That is why this alternate syntax right here is not going to work out as you might expect. So let me show you a couple diagrams to help you understand exactly why. So here's our Redux cycle. We've looked at this diagram a couple of times. At the very top, we've got our action creator. We call the action creator, it returns an action. That action is going to get dispatched automatically by the React Redux library, sent off to all of our different reducers. The reducers are going to rerun, and we get some new state object back. Now here's something very important to keep in mind. When we call an action creator, and it returns the action, and we dispatch it and it goes to our reducers, all of those steps right there are going to be executed in a fraction of a second. We're talking about like fractions of a millisecond here, amazingly quickly. So the time that it takes to call our action creator, return the action, and get that over to our reducers is as fast as you can possibly imagine, instantaneous. Now that causes an issue with the fact that we are making an asynchronous request here. Here's what is really going on behind the scenes. So I've got two separate flows here. On the left-hand side is what is happening inside of Redux. On the right-hand side is what is happening with our request. So we call our action creator. We return that action object. Again, we're talking about this refactored code right here, where we've got the promise on the payload property. We dispatch that action. So the action gets sent to all of our reducers. Our reducers run. We don't currently really have any functional reducers, but I'm sure you can imagine that we're going to want to reach into the response and pull out the list of posts that we fetched. But in this case, we do not yet have any data returned from that API. Remember, these series of steps right here, instantaneous, as fast as you can possibly imagine. Now, at the same time that we call the action creator, we are going to make the request over to the TypeICode API. That request is going to take some unknown amount of time. It might take 10 milliseconds. It might take 10,000 milliseconds. It might take 10 minutes. Who knows? It's going to take some crazy amount of time to eventually get a response back from that API. So by the time we finally get a response from the API, our action has long since been processed by our reducers. Our reducers have already ran, and they have looked inside that promise object and said, oh, the request isn't complete. And there's nothing that we can do inside of our reducers to somehow delay them from running. There's nothing we can do over here that says, hey, reducer, like, just hold on for a second, wait for this promise to get some data back, and then run yourself. That's not an option here. So I think you get the idea now. With this alternate syntax, when we return an object, it gets sent off to the reducers. But that all happens so quickly that it happens and completes itself way before we ever get any data back from our API. So in other words, even if we use this alternate syntax right here without the async or await, we would still run into an issue where we could not get access to our data. All right, so that's pretty much it. That is the two reasons that our fetch post action creator was not working as intended. The first one was pretty obvious, only in the fact that, I shouldn't say pretty obvious, I mean to say obvious in the fact that we got that big nasty error message. That's what I meant by that. I mean to say we saw an error message that made it very clear that something was going wrong. But the second problem was much more subtle and really requires you to understand what is going on behind the scenes with Redux. So now that we understand these big problems, we're going to take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to start to discuss how we're going to make use of this middleware thing called Redux Thunk and how it's going to solve all these issues. So quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute.